Welcome to 118th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. Back for lots more high quality sports economics content or economics applied to sport over the next few weeks up until Easter. We're very happy to start with Thomas Peeters. But before we start with Thomas Peeters, I'm just going to quickly try and share. It's a while since I shared my screen on Teams, actually. Now that we're back to doing meetings in person, I'm going to try and share and show you a couple of calls for papers that are out and are relevant. If you'll be able to find details in the calendar reminder that I sent for today for a number of conferences, not including Thomas's conference, which he's going to tell you about shortly, but that will soon to be added to future calendar invites for Rose's talks. But the first conference that I just want to mention, a call for papers or abstracts, is a conference that Bernd is organising in Paderborn, the 9th Football and Finance Edition, the Western of the Eastern and Western Conference, as it's been in recent years. And it's just Western for the time being, unfortunately. It is in person at Paderborn University and also at the stadium of SC Paderborn, 21st and 22nd of April. And the deadline for an abstract is the 28th of February. And if you want to do that, please do get in touch with Bernd, who's in the meeting. So you can either ask him in the meeting now or send him an email. Then I'm going to try and flick across to a call for the 17th Gijón Conference on Sports Economics, organised by Placido Rodriguez in Gijón. Will be the 5th and 6th of May. So if you're British and you want to avoid the coronation of King Charles III, this is a great way to avoid it. And it will be, as usual, taking place at the Labol site, part of the University of Oviedo, and you can submit, as always, abstracts to Placido at one of his two email addresses. I'll put them in the chat. The theme of the conference is Women Sports Economics. So if you have any work on women in sport, that's the theme for the conference. And please do give a consideration to submitting to those two excellent looking conferences. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand over to Thomas Peeters from Erasmus University. And the virtual floor is yours, Thomas.
Thank you, James. Hope you can hear me all right. So, all visible?
See it, yep.
Perfect. So yeah, let me just first start by saying this is a paper that Jan van Oers and I have been working on. And we are both at Erasmus University, and as it happens, we also organize a workshop on the 17th of February, which is a Friday. We have as speakers Bernd Frick, who's in the meeting, as well as Rachel Scarr from Edinburgh, Gabor Bekic from Central European University, Peter Dalton, and Francesco Principe. So that would be an excellent Friday afternoon if you want. You can sign up through our webpage, which is the eCase webpage. If you're interested, drop me a line and I can give you more information if you need it. So that's the commercial side. Now let's talk about this paper. So this has been sort of a project that we've been working on for quite a long time, and it's focused on international assortative matching in Europe. Frictionless movement in the labor market, so workers can go where they please, then you would expect, under some assumptions, that more productive workers end up working at more productive firms, because together they make a lot of surplus. And that sort of hypothesis has been dubbed positive assortative matching in the labor market literature. Now, of course, when workers cannot move freely for whatever reason, they might not end up at the place where they can produce most surplus. And if that sort of mismatching exists, so if the best workers do not end up where their abilities are most productive, the economy as a whole tends to lose, is the idea, because of this mismatch. Now, of course, obviously, when you think about the European labor market as a whole, you probably imagine that national borders can be quite a friction. And I myself work in a different European country than where I live. I live in Belgium, work in the Netherlands, so I can give you the first-hand account that that is indeed the case. There is some friction there by working in a different EU member state. But of course, when these frictions were to be gone, there could be large potential gains if workers indeed match assortatively or match efficiently across national borders. So what is this paper then trying to assess? Well, trying to get a first look at is this idea that, is this the case in Europe? So is it the case that these national borders present sufficient frictions for people to not go where they are most productive? And of course, there's good reason to believe that European labor markets are getting more integrated, because that's, of course, one of the big ambitions that the European Union has, is the free movement of labor across member states. And so I've put a little bit of a timeline here of how that has gone. So you can imagine that even when in the older days of the European Union, you were technically and legally allowed to work somewhere, if you need to get paid in a different currency than your home currency, that's another friction. If you need different social security arrangements, that's another friction, and so on. But the harmonization of all these kinds of institutions has definitely probably removed some of that burden. And of course, there's then some countries, of course, that reinstall burdens at their own by their own choice. So that would be what has happened to Brexit in 2016. But all in all, we think this is an important question because, of course, this is a pretty big economy and a pretty big labor market as a combined 32 countries contain 530 million people in the European Economic Area. So the question that we're trying to get at is this a frictionless, unified labor market for some occupations? So what is a bit the evidence out there in the literature on this? There's some papers that, well, are quite skeptical about this idea. And I think this paper by Bartz and Fuchsundlen in the European Economic Review, what they do is they look at workers on both sides of the border, and they see that the spatial correlation between regions that are on opposite sides of the border is much lower than the spatial correlation between regions that happen to be on the same side of the border. So that would mean that if in the region just across the border people are unemployed, that correlates with the other region on that side of the border, but not so much with the region in the other European country. They interpret that as evidence that there's indeed still frictions there, so that the unemployed don't cross the borders to get jobs. On the other hand, there's also some other papers that seem to point to the opposite, or at least some sort of, you might say, less, less negative story to some extent. There's this paper by Head and Mayer in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which had actually a special issue on this, which documents a steep decline in this sort of migration frictions in the European Economic Area. And then this paper by Dorn and Zweimüller, sort of in the same issue, despite this decline, says there's still persistent transnational differences in EU labor market outcomes, so that must come from somewhere. And another recent paper I want to point out is this paper by Bailey et al. In the American Economic Review, where they study a Swiss migration reform that allowed high-skilled people to move across the border, and they find that it did work to alleviate some of the high-skilled worker shortage in Switzerland. So our question is slightly different from what's been asked in these papers, because we will specifically be focusing on this idea of assortative matching. And we will be looking at one high-skilled labor market in particular. And given we're in the roses, you might have guessed that this labor market has something to do with sports. So what we will do is we will look for assortative matching, evidence of assortative matching across European countries. And we're going to do this in a high stakes, high skilled environment. We find, in fact, evidence that there is positive assortative matching in this international market, and that it's driven by people that are internationally mobile at the high end of the market. The market in this case is the market of football managers, which is, we will argue, a high stakes, high skilled environment. But it also has some obvious advantages from a research perspective. So what do we sort of contribute to this literature is that I think we're one of the earlier papers to look at international assortative matching. So we look at people moving across country rather than people moving to firms within one country. The good thing about the industry that we study is that it has very high frequency data on worker performance, but we also complement that with financial output of firms. So we have gathered quite a lot of financial information on football firms in different European countries, and we can match that. The good thing as well is we would argue. And what's also nice is that we can use separate information to estimate worker and firm productivity, which allows us to avoid some of the methodological issues that this literature has suffered from. All right, so that's if you leave now, that's what I wanted to tell you as a sort of selling talk of the paper. Let me now go into somewhat more of the details. And the first thing that I want to talk to you about is how we measure assortative matching. And I don't know how familiar most of you are with these methods, but sort of the classic way of doing that is a paper from 1999, Econometrica about et al., AKM, also called for about Kramers and Margelis. What they do is they take the wages of a worker and they regress them on a set of observables and then a worker and firm fixed effect. And they look for the correlation between these two, arguing that if the two are positively correlated, that would seem to imply positive assortative matching. Now, this has faced a little bit of a headwind, not in the least because this methodology tends to find no positive, or at least not significantly positive, correlation between these two fixed effects. So people have been wondering quite a lot, why is that so? And then there's been two lines of research, I would say. One is looking at more the estimation issues, and a couple of examples are paper by Andrews et al. And Jochmans and Whitener in Econometrica that point to limited mobility of workers that creates a problem. Because if people don't work for many firms, which most people do, then they then these two fixed effects will automatically be negatively correlated, even though they are not in reality. So that's an artifact of estimating the two of them from the same wage equation effectively. There's also some theory development about why you would not expect monotonicity in this sort of setting. And as you can see, most of these papers, if you're smart enough to do this kind of thing, you get into the top 5, right? So that's basically what this boils down to. So what is then the solution? And of course, that's where we sort of will build upon. One of the solutions is let's just not look at fixed effects that come from the same equation. So if the two are biased downward in terms of correlation. Let's just use two different equations to get at the worker and the firm's productivity. And that's what, for example, Mendes et al. Do. They estimate worker productivity from the wage equation. They estimate their productivity of firms from an output equation of the firm, sort of production function, and then they look at the correlation between those two rankings. So that gets you out of this problem of limited mobility. Bartolucci et al. They look at profits. Bagger and Lenz have still another approach for doing this. So what we will do is, of course, think about, can sports help us here? And the good news is, yes, I think we think they can. And we're not the first to think about this. So there's a paper by Gandelman that looks at Uruguayan football players. There's a paper by Jan and Philip and Antonio, I think it's Antonio Philippin, that looks at Italian runners. And then there's Brut and Duhautois that also look at Italian football. What they typically do is they look at the performance of the workers tend to go and play for the best football teams in terms of sporting performance. Now that's slightly different from what we do, because what we do is we make this distinction between the productivity as being the sporting results and the productivity as being the ability to make these sporting results into revenues. So the reasoning behind our model is that it's the job of the worker to make physical output, to make sporting results. So the job of the coach in our case is to make the team productive, to make a lot of wins, if you like, with as little payroll as possible. The job of the firm is to take these wins and make money out of wins. And so what we will say is unique to some extent in this industry is that we see both of those things. It's as if we would go to a factory that makes chemicals and we would see how much chemicals came out in hectoliters or in kilograms or in tons, and we would then see how expensive these are sold. And you would say, well, the workers are really the ones that are making chemicals. It's the firm's job to sell those chemicals as expensive as they can. So that's what we sort of, the trick that we use here is, let's rank the workers based on how good they are in making the output. And let's rank the firms on how good they are at selling this output in the markets for dollars or euros, in this case, pounds. Sorry for the UK's citizens among us. So that's the idea here. So that's going to get us out of some of the trouble in this econometric literature that have been around. So what is this data set? This data set is sort of it's a little bit of a baby of mine. So I've spent too much time gathering this, probably, but now it's there. So now let's use it. So what is this? It's 9 countries from 2000 to 2018. Not all of them are there the entire period. So the latest ones come in at around 2007. That would be Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. So the ones that we do have are the ones colored red on the map. So that's so the UK in this case. It's not an accident. Scotland is in there. So it's Scotland, England, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, and Portugal. What we have here is 316 employers, as we will call football clubs in this presentation, for which we have the financial accounts data. So that comes from various sources. For the UK, it's, for example, Companies House. For Germany, it's the Bundesanzeiger. For Italy, it's the Chamber of Commerce. For France, is the DNCG. So that's various sources where we got all this information. What we essentially need from the accounts is how much the workers are being paid, so the total salary of the club and the revenues that are made. We look at the managers in this case, so we're not concerned with the players. You might do a similar study on players. We choose managers because the nice thing about manager is that each club has exactly one. So if we rank managers from the most productive to the least productive, we get a ranking that is the same dimension as the number of clubs, because every club has one head coach. We have 678 different workers in here, where we put as a sort of bottom line that they have to have 34 games in our sample for us to estimate their quality or ability or productivity in a credible way. We have 49,000 games being played in all of these competitions, first level, second level, and European combined. So we use, the nice thing is that we also see them facing off between countries in the Champions League and Europa League. So we can actually also use that to get some idea about the relative strengths in the different countries. So this is what that data set boils down to at the game level. So we have these countries' first divisions, we have second divisions for a subset of them, and then we have European games between teams from these respective countries. Of course, that is quite a large amount of all Champions League and Europa League games are played between these countries because they contain the most prominent football countries in Europe, without trying to make any offense here. So what you see is Belgium from 2008 is the last one coming in together with Portugal, Germany 2007. We have about at least a couple thousand games. What's the difference between initial sample, raw sample, net sample? That has to do with the selection on the observables. So we need, our estimation will use the wage bill of the team. So that gets us from initial to raw. And then we want every coach to have 34 observations in there. So we don't look at coaches that have less. So that gets us to net sample. So that's that procedure I can get into more detail. But the reason you throw away so many is that if you play someone that we throw away, you're also losing that game for yourself. And so suppose that Klopp is in the coach that has very few games in the sample. Actually, that game is not useful for us because both managers also loses an observation. And so you go through that cycle until you're left with people with 34 observations playing other people with 34 observations at least. All right. So what is a football manager? This slide is maybe a little bit redundant here. This person on the right, he's a football manager. Well, we should put some more flags here, but this is what these kinds of careers look like. You go from Porto to Chelsea to Inter to Real Madrid to Chelsea again to Manchester United to Tottenham to AS Roma and maybe some more. The idea being, of course, that many of them are quite mobile. So of the 678 that we have, there's 154 that have not moved, so that we see at just one firm. Now that's quite exceptional because if you think about other data sets where people are trying to do this, the majority of workers, when you look at a decade of data, actually doesn't move. So in that sense, this is a research asset for us, but it's probably an external validity downside because this is not typical. If you think about the European labor market in particular, people tend to be quite steadfast. So it's not typical that people move as much as these people do. Of those that are mobile, the majority stays within one country. And this can be their own country or another country. So if you are observed in a country the first time and you only observed in that country, you fall within this category. And then there's 133 that actually have moved between countries. So this is what that transition matrix look like. So people move from a certain country to a certain country. And so what you can, for example, see is that for logically, for example, for Belgium, the country that most people move to is actually the Netherlands. That's not so surprising. That's the move that I made myself as well. So we're just very close by. You wouldn't notice if you cross the border. People speak the same language. Well, part of it's complicated, but some people speak the same language anyway. So that helps, obviously. And if you then look at sort of these other transitions, England to Scotland, obviously that makes sense. There's some interesting patterns here that sort of point to just countries being close together culturally or distance-wise. It's also notable that there is, for example, a notable difference between how much migrants countries typically take up. And this is what you see here. So this is a percentage of foreign managers over time. And maybe unsurprisingly to the UK audience here, England is the champion of this. Actually, Belgium is there with you. They're not in this graph, but we are the most welcoming countries in this respect, I would say. And it's much more likely for a British coach or a manager of a British club to be a foreigner than it is for most of the other countries. For example, the Netherlands in most years has no foreign coaches at all. So that's a remarkable difference. You might wonder why that is. Okay, so that's a little bit about the data that we use. By the way, I can't see the chat window, so if you have posted questions there, excuse, I don't see that. All right, so what are we going to do with the data? So the first thing we're going to try and do is to sort of replicate what's being done in the literature. And in the literature, the focus is on how correlated are these two, are the rankings of the worker productivity and the firm's productivity. And so the idea is if the best workers are correlated with the best firms, that means that indeed people have somehow moved to where their labor is worth the most. And so people make rankings of the workers, typically make rankings of the firms, fixed effects or something that indicates productivity, and they look at the correlation between these two. So what we do is a three-step procedure which mimics that for our labor market. So we first want to rank the workers by their contribution to the physical output. So basically ranking them by how much do they impact performance of the team that they coach. Second, we want to rank the firms. And as I said, in our thinking for this paper, what the firms really do is to sell the performance. And so they are ranked by the revenue productivity, so the extra revenues they generate from an additional win. And then we investigate the rank correlation between these two objects. And so we can do that at the national level. We can see among all the firms in England or in the UK or among all the firms in the Netherlands, what is the correlation between the workers ranking and the firm ranking. But we can also do that at the European level and say on the 1st of September or the 1st of August when the season starts, where are the most productive workers, and is that at the firms where an additional win is worth most money. So what does that look like in practice? For the worker output productivity, our baseline is going to be to estimate what looks like an AKM model based on match outcomes. So basically, the match between team I and team J at time T is decided by a home parameter. So the idea is that teams that play at home have more chance of winning. see also James's other work during COVID and all of that. That is also driven by some observables. In practice, the most important one here is going to be the total wage bill of the firm. We allow for the two teams to have a fixed effect in output productivity, and then the two managers, so manager M of team I and manager N of team J, they both figure in this game. So that's also why we need your opponent's manager to be visible to us as well as your own manager. We estimate this overall of our games. We allow some of these parameters to differ by division. So L is an indicator of, for example, England second division can have different home advantage from England first division and so on and so forth. We rescale all of these mu m's by the average. So the average manager will be a zero fixed effect. So this is again the data that we use to do that on. It's pretty much the same data that I showed you before. What will be our object of interest on the left-hand side, goals scored, and on the right-hand side, mainly this wage bill variable. So that's what this looks like. So as you can see, in European competition, home advantage worth about half a goal. And that's also true for actually most of these leagues. So first division in Belgium is 0.44, and you can go down this list. Second division, the wage bill matters everywhere, even when we control for firm fixed effects. The important parts for our purposes here is, of course, what is explained by these different fixed effects. And so the manager fixed effects we find correlates, if you take this partial correlation, so the covariance of the manager with the results over the total variance in results, it's about 5%. And sometimes this is sort of interpreted as a partial R squared. So if the total R squared of our regression is 22%, 14% comes from the time varying covariance, so that's the home advantage as well as the wages. 3% or so comes from team productivity in outputs, and 5%, 5.5% is due to these manager fixed effects. If we plot them after rescaling, we find this thing on the right, and it will please you to know that this guy is this outlier on the very far right. So for the Atletico Madrid fans, great news. Never let go is what I would say, because this person, according to our estimates, is worth about a goal per game. That's of compared to the average manager, the average of the 600 plus managers in here. There's also second division managers in Italy here, right? So there is quite some. The spectrum of managers is quite wide, but still, this is quite. It's almost. I mean, we've had this result in other papers before, but if you think about what it would cost to have a goal more per game in terms of wage bills, that would be enormous. So whatever they're paying him, it's probably worth it. If the time comes. Data runs until 2018, so some of your more recent grudges will not be in here yet. So what do we get when we look at sort of national averages here? So the average manager fixed effect in the Netherlands, where they shun foreigners, as you might remember from a previous graph, is actually quite a bit lower than, for example, in the first division in France, England, and Italy. So that sort of already indicates a little bit that what we're about to do next. And as you can see, there is quite some increase also in England. You might speculate who enters the English leagues by the end of this period, but it's not people that have low fixed effects, I can tell you that. So then the next, the right hand side of our correlation is going to be this revenue productivity. Yeah? So the idea that some firms are just better or just more able or more cunning in selling their wins, so they are making more euros or pounds per point or per goal or per whatever you want. And for this, we're going to use a sort of a log revenue function where the revenues depend on your goal difference by season, because this is going to be seasonal data. We use the tangible assets as approximate for if you have your own stadium. A firm league and year fixed effect here. That's are sort of trying to soak up most of what's related to TV deals, fixed parts of even maybe marketing deals and so on and so forth. Obviously, if you play more attractive opponents, that's also to your advantage. The goal here is to calculate the marginal revenue per goal difference. And so what we'll do is we'll estimate this model, then we'll add one goal here to your Y, and we'll see how much higher we predict your revenues to be using this simple model. So what we then get is a figure that looks like this. Obviously, there's quite some inflation in this as well. And that's quite so important that we rank everybody every year again. And so that everybody gets compared to everybody at the start of 2012, at the start of 2013, at the start of 2014. So in that sense, it's your relative ranking at that point that's going to matter in the end, because obviously everybody makes more money now per point than they did in 2010. So also here, what we find is that tangible assets are good for you. Goal difference is also positive and significant, but then the real drivers of the difference here between the clubs are these sets of fixed effects for firm, league, and year. That's going to set them apart. So who makes the most per goal in Europe? Sort of unsurprisingly, it's Real Madrid. Who makes the least? I think this is Pontafiel or something. It's a Portuguese club. It's the least revenue productive club in this data. So who is sort of to give you some feel for what we estimate and whether it makes any sense to you. So what is our estimate of marginal revenue by league? And I think the best thing to do is to look at this column since 2008. So our estimate for example, the English Premier League is that clubs on average make 873,000 euros per extra goal per season. So a goal difference per season, think that the best teams have something like plus 30, plus 40, so that's what we're looking at. Is slightly favored here by the fact that its largest teams. English second division, of course, is quite a bit lower. French second division and Italian second division are actually the smallest in this sample. But you can see that even within the sample of first divisions, obviously the differences are quite substantial. What does this look like if you take a look at sort of which is the top 20? Well, that reads a little bit like the Deloitte Money League, really. So that, in a sense, is somewhat reassuring, if you like, about what this means. And obviously, when we plot this over time, as I said, there is inflation, so the value of a point has been going up over time in these first divisions. And as you can see, the English Premier League sort of is the clear leader in this respect. All right. So then we bring these two together. So we have a ranking of the firms, we have a ranking of the workers. Now we're going to take the first game of the season, and our reasoning here is because that's after a period in which it's been possible for teams or for firms to rematch. And so you've been able to go on the market and hire who you wanted, or you've been able to keep your coach if you were happy. So we select the first game. We collapse everything to this firm worker year level, and then we rank everybody that's active at that time. And so we look at the 200 plus firms, we look at the 200 plus workers that they had, we rank every worker, we rank all the firms, and then we make rankings at national level. So we rank everybody in the Netherlands, every firm in the Netherlands. We rank also across all our different countries. And then we calculate simply the Spearman rank correlation by year. And what's presented on the right is then the average of these Spearman rank correlations. So what we find is that overall, the correlation between these two objects is 0.45. If we then look, this is the transnational correlation. If we then look at the different countries, we see that we find comparable numbers at the national level. So the rankings at national level are about as correlated as they are in sort of the international market, if you like. And of course, I don't want to read too much into the differences between all of these things because there's some conceptual problems with that. For example, there is of course much more observations in the ranking of the overall market. So it's not to say that 0.453 is directly comparable to the Belgium score of 0.279. I think what's important to note is that all of this is positive and it's all significantly different from zero. So there is positive assortative matching. It's not a small amount of positive assortative matching. Whether you can say that the one is higher than the other is really a difficult exercise. It's clear that it's not the case that there is no assortative matching at the international level, and there is assortative matching at the national level. That would point to strong frictions. Well, that's not the case in this data set or in this exercise. So I put some graphs here. So on the left, these are all the data points. So this is ranking of 1 to 200 in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and so on, all on the same graph. It's a bit of a soup, but you can sort of see a positive correlation here. If we bin these things together a little bit, then it becomes much clearer that this positive correlation is fairly obvious from glancing over these two rankings. To give you some, to warm your sporting heart a little bit, we also have this graph where we put some actual names to these numbers. And so the orange, the aptly colored orange coach is Ronald Koeman. He's Dutch, as you might know, probably the most Dutch looking person apart from King Alexander that you might find. And he worked in the Netherlands for quite a while. So you can see here that he was sort of ranked at around, so higher is better on this axis, by the way. So he was ranked sort of at around place 130 when he was at Alkmaar, Feyenoord, Feyenoord being the bigger team, so that means moving up. Then he moved up still more to Everton, Southampton. It's less clear why he would be selected to move up to a team that's even higher on this ranking, because he clearly is not close to the top of the managerial fixed effects ranking. By contrast, for example, the person in green here, he was consistently on the right of the ranking of the manager fixed effects. He's also in the very upper end of the clubs that have earnings per point. So in that sense, it makes sense that Pep Guardiola would stay in this sort of upper right corner, because that's where he's most, that would be an example of positive assortative matching. Mourinho, sadly, we don't have his Porto years here, because that would be, of course, for him, sort of the move that made him go to that sort of assured his positive assortative matching, if you like. But obviously he's also not very low ranked. He gets a little bit lower ranked over time. As you can see, his Manchester United period didn't really help his manager fixed effect much. But clearly he would be up there. And we have also Ferguson here, not a mover, but sort of already in his place with his first observation that we have on him at United. So that's a little bit how the logic of this model works. We do several other things. So one thing is we ask ourselves, is this rank correlation higher in the sample of country movers versus non-country movers? You would expect that the country movers are, of course, the ones that are responsible for the positive assortative matching, because the difference between clubs across countries is huge in terms of marginal revenues. So people must move across country to sort of make their move towards the place where they are most productive. We find that that is indeed the case, that this is more that the rank correlation is higher in these country movers. We also do drop Germany, Portugal, and Scotland because our sample of clubs for which we have the financials is least representative in these three countries. It doesn't seem to matter much to the overall picture. Here's another one where we put the percentage of foreign managers on the left-hand side, and you can see clearly that's also that the clubs that have rankings that have the biggest marginal revenue, that they are also the ones that hire most foreign managers. So it seems that if you're at the very high end of this market, it's just impossible to find what you need in terms of the best workers within your own country. So it forces you to look further than your own little national labor market. All right, then we wondered, there's integration and there's disintegration in this data set. In particular, there is one pretty important country that's represented by two leagues here, Scotland and England, that's leaving the European Union in our time frame. Well, right by the end, but still. So has that had any effect so far? Well, we're looking to expand this to 2019. Of course, 2020, a great year for sports economics research from the exogenous shock angle. But for this exercise, we think probably less representative of the normal situation. We find that the Spearman rank correlation does not differ over time that much. So this is, as I said before, we calculate this every year. So we make a ranking in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If we take a look at the rank correlation in year 2009, for example, that's then one of the lower ones. It goes up in 2010, it goes down again in 2012. It's not that we can tie that to any event, so we don't want to put too much emphasis on the slight oscillation that we see here. We think it's just more or less 0.4 throughout this time period. And as you can see, with the addition of more countries, of course, the sample slightly grows. There's also a slight improvement in the availability of accounts in some countries. So that's the first exercise. So that's more or less replicating some of the things that are prevalent in this literature. We do some more work, and that's sort of where we are now, trying to work also on the suggestion of certain reviewers, and that's to look at the moving workers in more detail, because obviously these people are presumably responsible for making this market positively assortatively matched. So this is again a breakdown of what this looks like. So we have 2,600 worker year observations. Out of this, 624 are for a first worker year or a single worker year. So basically, it's impossible to move for them because they would be, it's their only or first observation. So that's that. Then there's 1,200 that are not moving, but also not first year. So they basically stay put. And then there's 792 that we see in a new employment. Of those, 650 year observations are in the same country and 142 are in another country. So they are the international movers. So what we then do is we use our firm rankings to distinguish between up and downward movement, where we say that you move up if you move to a club that's higher on the marginal revenue ranking. So if you move from Antwerp FC to Manchester United, that would be a move up. If you move from Manchester United to AS Roma, that would be a move down, presumably. So what we see is that the percentage of moves up and down is more or less the same for the international moves and the within country moves. It's 60-40. Now, you might, well, the thing is, of course, at some point, some of the people that have moved up then just stop, right? So Ferguson, for example, does never move down, right? Because he stopped at his prime. And that's true for, there's more people that then don't make this last downward move than there's people. So that's why the up movement is slightly more than the down movement. What we're interested in is whether the worker fixed effect ranking can explain this. So when we look at all movers, we see that if we do a probit, upward move is 1, 0. No, it's linear probability model, sorry. Upward move is 1, 0 otherwise. Among all movers, the worker fixed effect rank has a coefficient of about 0.25. Across country and within country, we find the same coefficient. Why is the rank of your current firm negative? Because obviously, if you're already at the top, for example, Guardiola, when you're at Manchester, when you're at Bayern Munich or at Barcelona, the places where you can still go up are quite limited, and so that's why we find a negative coefficient here. What's surprising to some extent is that there seems to be no difference between moving internationally and moving nationally in this sort of models, and that's something that we are now trying to explore a little bit further. So that's the end of my story, more or less. What we conclude for the manager, football manager market is that we think that there's quite strong evidence for assortative matching across EU borders, which stands a little bit in contrast to the more or less limited evidence of conversion in what you might call the general labor market. Why do we think that is true? Or why do we think that this market behaves like this? Well, for one thing, it's obvious if we can observe performance at all of these firms, so can firms. And if we find, if our estimates are true, then this is also quite a high stakes environment. It's not all of us that go to work on a Saturday evening and our performance is worth several hundreds thousands of euros per go. My papers are well read, of course, but I doubt that my one day productivity is near any of those numbers. We see a lot of international mobility, especially in the high end of the market, so that must be so that probably points to the same thing. We also see no increase in assortativeness over the sample period, also no decrease. And so despite the fact that there's some sort of frictions being added to the international scene. Then we think a little about external validity. And of course, the one thing that you might wonder is, are these findings football markets? And so one labor market that we obviously think about is that of academia, because like in football coaches, you might say it's quite obvious what productivity means. It's also quite obvious what research productivity can be measured like, and it's also quite hard to conceal what the research productivity of workers is. The same thing is true for inventors, for singers, for actors, and so on. So you might wonder, in these very high-end, high-skilled labor markets, where we do see, and that's also true for academia, we also see a lot of international mobility in academia, maybe there this assortative matching is also present. That might be pretty positive news, actually, because if you think about where would the damage to the economy be large if positive assortative matching does not happen? Well, it's exactly in these labor markets where individuals are, where very talented individuals are scarce, and where their individual productivity is very important to the firm. So if this picture that we paint here for the football coaches can also be painted for the inventor labor market in Europe, the academia labor market in Europe, and so on and so forth, then maybe the integration process is not such a failure after all. Of course, there's things absent here that are not absent in other industries. A big one being occupational licensing. There is the UEFA or FIFA license that you need to obtain, but it's not the most difficult degree to get if you're a former player in particular. And of course, what you need to do in all of these countries is very homogeneous. You probably deal with the same types of players everywhere. Language barriers are present everywhere. So in that sense, it's probably a very homogeneous thing to do in different countries. That's what I have, James.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. Really interesting talk. Plenty for any questions and comments folk might have. If you do want to ask a question or a comment, please do raise your hand. No one's jumping. Oh, someone is there. There you go. Just took a moment to Jose, first of all.
Hi. Hi, Thomas. Very nice paper, I mean, about the assortative matching. So I'm sorry about Panafia, who was close to my parents' place, by the way.
Okay.
But,
Was it them? Was it the right logo?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Fortunately. Okay. Yeah, a few questions. One, I was thinking in terms of about value added. So because some cultures, they moved into also very very nice clubs and big ones. And so do they also bring something different from the previous coach or not? I was thinking, so does it make sense? Then I've also, it wasn't unclear for me how you define the moving up and moving down. So it's based on international ranking or not. So you mentioned also the issues about AKM, but did you try? So did you find this negative correlation between the fixed effects, or because you find assortative matching, so you can also see if using AKM gives you very different results? And the last comment is about the migration flows of managers compared to the migration flows of players. You say that, if I remember correctly, like English and also English market and the Belgian market are very welcome to foreigners. Is it like relatively to the players the same story or not? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So let me start by sort of the last, which also relate to your own work with the Bosman ruling. So the thing with the coaches, of course, there's not been a really ever a formal rule on them moving anywhere, as far as the European Union in any case is concerned. Still, we see that the migration patterns are, for example, the Netherlands really has almost no foreign coaches, and relatively similar to that, it also has a very high minimum wage for players from foreign origin. So they go hand in hand in this case. I'm hesitant to say that it's a systematic thing because I know the situation in the Netherlands and Belgium quite well, and there the contrast is quite stark. I'm not sure that this is true for the other countries. I'm not aware. So one thing that's also on our to-do list is this occupational licensing thing that I mentioned in the end, that some countries might have rules that you have to have their national diploma to be a coach. We're looking into that at the moment because I know that, for example, Belgium has its own sort of degree, but it's also fine if you have the UEFA degree. So I'm not sure whether that's true everywhere. So that's another thing that goes into that question. Your second question on the AKM, I'm happy that now I did make an appendix slides. So this is so what we can do is we have this output regression where there's the firm and the manager, both of them. And so that's, we can also look at their correlation. So are the most productive firms from this idea also attracting the most productive managers? The answer is no. So this is the typical. So the question is, of course, here we would run into trouble with, for example, limited mobility bias. And so it could be that this is a biased result. It could also, of course, be, and then anecdotally, you think automatically. I think of Manchester United. I know if Johan is here, but I know he's a fan. But this would be the kind of club that does seem to hire coaches that are supposedly of high ability, but the club itself is not able to transform payroll into results very well. And so that's unfortunately my own club Antwerp. I count also in that category typically. So that's that correlation seems to be at least maybe it's truly absent, as this might imply, or it's also suffering from limited mobility bias. If we do these kinds of tests, I don't know if you're familiar with this Jochmans and Whitener paper, where they sort of look at this connectivity of the network, and if the network is sufficiently connected, then the limited mobility bias is not so bad. That's fine for this market, in the sense that obviously the mobility here is higher than in the average labor market. So it's not that they have in their paper this sort of they basically take a player, I think, on teacher added value to the slaughterhouse in their own paper in Econometrica, where they show like what that correlation is completely biased. We pass their sort of back into sort of their testing quite well with this data set. So that would suggest that this truly is an absent correlation rather than a biased downward correlation. So yeah, that's what we can do with AKM. We can also, I think your first comment on the value added and the coach. So in this sort of model that we sort of sketch, the coach has nothing to do with the revenue generating process. And so he's sort of a manual labor that makes wins, and that's obviously a simplification. And if you think about the impact of some of the coaches, probably that is where we make a strong assumption here, because probably you think of some coaches as playing much more attractive football, which is much easier to market than others. So in that sense, yeah, that's absent here. So that's true. That's a true limitation of what we do here. I think your final thing was about up and down. So for that, what we look at is so basically we so we look every time at the first game of the season, because that's sort of the idea of you've been able to match, and you've matched with yes this team and not that team. So if you're a mover, that would mean that in, let's say, 2009 we saw you at the team ranked 35 in Europe. In the year after, we see you at a team ranked 54. Then we say you move down. Not so only if you move team, not because your team moved with you, right? So if you're at the same team, but your team might move down or up in the ranking, that's not considered to be an up or down move. If you're very unfortunate, you might, of course, move down with your team and then move up again to another team that's then higher. That's so it's only when you are at a different team that we evaluate the ranking of the two teams, and then we look at the final year with your previous team. What was the ranking of? What was the end ranking of your previous team? Let's put it that way. So that's how we do the up or down. Whether we do that nationally or internationally is not super important in terms of the ranking, because the rankings are the national ranks are to some extent sub rankings of the international ranking, right? So so you would, in terms of just a simple up or down, if you're a national mover, you would also be considered up or down if we would just take the national ranking. So in that sense, it's sort of yeah, it's a very simple idea here, and in that sense, whether we use the international or the national ranking for the national movers is actually not consequential for that exercise.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But thanks for the questions. Really, yeah.
Thanks, Jose. Stefan was next.
Morning, Thomas.
Morning.
I think 90 minutes of your time on a Saturday evening is worth many thousands of dollars. So,
so next time we spend 90 minutes on a Saturday night, that's I sent a bill, Ann Arbor.
Yeah, well, you can send it. Feel free. I have 5 comments. It's really great. It's really, really interesting. So, and I probably some of these are misunderstandings, but so my first point was marginal revenue of a win. It strikes me that if you're in the championship, so think of the championship final game, right? That the marginal revenue of that win is £100 million, right? So in some sense, your marginal revenue is only calculated on current season earnings, whereas and it's probably most important if you're on the borderline of Champions League qualification, where that. So I don't know how you account for that, but I think that's something you might think about. The second thing was, in terms of this measure of your overall Spearman rank 0.453, is there some way to give a sense of how big that number is? I mean, I get this idea that it's bigger than you find in other assorted matching studies, but I was thinking, and the fact that the country movers was much larger than the stayers I thought that was very persuasive. But I was wondering if there's some kind of counterfactual analysis you might do. Could you? And I was thinking, could you conceivably run a model where all the managers of a given nationality are assigned to the club that's the closest club to the one they were moved to internationally, and then imagine then that everybody just is stuck with their own country, and then see how that would look. I don't know if that's possible, but I thought that'd be interesting. The third thing was I was sort of, and that maybe again it was probably confusion. I was sort of getting mixed up about nationality. So and the issue of the Dutch. So is it that we're talking about the Dutch, the people who manage, who are managing in the Netherlands, or are we talking about managers of Dutch nationality? Because again, if you think about managers of English nationality, are not great traditionally, we think, right? So the fact that the England managers look good, the managers in England look good, doesn't mean to say that English managers are any good. And maybe, I don't know if maybe you're just not thinking about this nationalities per se of the manager, but I think that might be interesting. The fourth thing is the including the Champions League and Europa League in your calculation. I wonder if you've run this without including those games, because seems to me there's a sort of bias there in favor of the English clubs. English managers had the advantage in Europe of having been exposed to some of the best players in the world already before they go into the Champions League. So that would seem to be upwardly bias the ability of English based managers, simply because they've got this inherent advantage because England can afford to bring in all the best players. And then finally, the last one is discrimination. Famously, black players can't get jobs in management in football in Europe, not in England, not in most countries. Although they constitute a very large fraction of the players, they're not getting jobs in management. And that seems to me to be some, in terms of assortative matching, I mean, that seems to be a real question about what even we mean by assortative matching. I mean, you know, if you're biased against a certain group, I mean, how is that going to play into it? So thanks. So those are my points.
Yeah, let me go through them one by one then, in terms of trying to answer them. I don't have answers for all of them. So I think the first one that you mentioned is just it's well taken, and so I think the idea of looking at them so what we currently have is a league specific, team specific sort of revenue function. So that does mean by tier in this case. So the championship one would be different from the Premier League one, but obviously it's within your championship year. And so that's where you're right. I mean, and obviously the real bonanza comes the next year, which is not something that we currently have. So one thing that I've been thinking about is whether we can do things like trying to get at chance of promotion and so on and so forth. And that's sort of calculating what that would be worth. And then saying how so instead of looking at score difference, thinking about things like probability of qualifying for, and then a score difference translates into a certain probability of qualifying for based on historical accounts, and then what is that worth to qualify for Champions League, Premier League, and so on and so forth. And obviously avoiding relegation being the counter of that, because that it's we haven't done it. I haven't seen it being done. But if you have a good reference for anybody that has this model, sure, happy to use it. So and that's a point well taken. I mean that is a clear simplification of reality that we do here. I think your idea of doing counterfactual with no international movement is actually great. I think we'll do that. So one of the so what we can do is we can, for example, stay and that also goes to your third point, is nationality versus, and I've been using these terms a little bit loose. I realize now in this presentation, there's two things here. There's nationality and there's where you first coached. And so those can be different. So because so for example, the Belgian league sometimes by people in the Belgian press is regarded as sort of a testing ground for all of Eastern Europe's produce, and in some extent, and we have a lot of former Yugoslavian coaches. We have Romanian coaches, and so on and so forth, which are not Belgian, but in our sample they first appear in Belgium, and so then in that sense they might be already international movers, but in our sample, they are not international movers because they are in Belgium and then they stay in Belgium. So in that sense, there's a distinction. When I say international movers, I mean someone that's appeared in two countries. You might also appear in one country, not being your country of birth or your country of origin. you might think that these people then have managed in Romania or former Yugoslavia. That doesn't have to be the case, because often they played in Belgium, became coach in Belgium, and have never gone back to Croatia or wherever they are from. So there is a distinction there. When it comes to the Dutch, though, it is that they hire Dutch managers, not just people that were first in the Netherlands, but real Dutch managers. And the same, to some extent, is true for some other countries. I don't share your, you keep saying that the English coaches are so terrible. I don't really share your sentiment in this. It's more that you hire the best of the rest, and then you make your managers compete to them. Obviously, they're gonna look bad. But if we would have Mourinho in the Belgian league or Guardiola, I'm sure that Belgian managers would look equally bleak. So in that sense, I don't. So if any discrimination is going on here, it's a Szymanski bias towards the English. Anyway, having said that, I need to be more specific about that, and I think we can do more with that, because obviously you would think that and that's also something that we want to do with this last regression. It should be that the burden of going to yet another country when you're already outside of your country of birth is probably less. And so it would seem that if you're indeed a coach in the Netherlands, or in Belgium or in France, but you're, for example, from Brazil, whether you then go to the UK or you go to Germany or stay in France, that's probably not so important to you. So that's probably some way where we can do more. Estimating without Champions League, Europa League. I think I've done it at some point. I don't remember what that gave. So maybe revisit that. The discrimination towards on racial grounds, as a similar problem here, I think, with discrimination on gender grounds, is that we can only look at the people that are in. And that's, of course, we don't know the pool of potential managers in this data set. So in that sense, we can, there's even so, it's so sad that there's so little coaches of for example, African origin, that we simply cannot estimate because there's just too few to even do that. So that's, yeah. So probably there, I would say probably there is quite, you're probably quite right. But in the scope of this exercise, it's really hard to have something meaningful to say about that.
At the very least, you could say it in your paper and make this point.
Yes.
I think that would be the thing.
That we will we can put a summary stat on that, and then say we can also put the gender dummy there, and then say look at this labor market. So that's another one where we are probably, that's one to mention also in the external validity section for sure. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Stefan. Danielle is next.
Yes, hi, hello to everybody. This is my first time at Roses, and so thanks for James for inviting me, and hi to everybody. Very interesting paper, Thomas. I had a couple of questions on, one on estimating the manager fixed effects. So if I understand correctly, you're controlling for the wage bill, and then you have club fixed effects. And so the club fixed effects, once you control the wage bill, is capturing something like, this club is well run, maybe it has a, great home stadium or some other sort of intrinsic advantage that is, constant over time. But I'm thinking about, Man City being taken over by, the Emiratis, and or, this, there are these, clear structural changes that, some clubs are, just undergo a big transformation, and it's not just it's more money, but it could be just, it become more professional, more, well run, in other forms. And I was wondering whether, that type of, those types of changes, whether they sort of induce you to find a sort of stronger correlation between the the manager fixed effects and the marginal revenue, because once the residual now looks larger if like a country a club has gone from being sort of a kind of a middling club to now a superpower. So that was sort of one question, and the other question I guess I was I'm not sure I quite understood your marginal revenue regressions, because it looks very similar to the manager fixed effect regression, but you're switching the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So I think maybe there was an issue of timing, that you're looking at like revenue in T+1 on results in T. Was that, I thought that was a little bit unclear, and I was a bit confused with that. And then final thing, I'm going to plug my colleagues' work. So Kevin Lang and Shu Khan and my student Cesar Garro-Marin have a paper on assortative matching in academia, which you touched upon in the at the end, and they're finding zero correlation, like in the, if I remember correctly, the which I think that you find as well in your, when you do the traditional AKM model. So that's something worth thinking about. I'll send you the link. But very interesting paper. Thanks for presenting.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. I definitely want to look at that paper, and it's one that we need to incorporate here. I think your first point on the manager fixed effects is quite right. One of the challenges here is that the managers are, if you take the fixed effects of the firms and then the managers are almost are the higher frequency fixed effect, right? So they are indeed, if anything is going to pick up on sort of these changes in ownership and so on, the managers change, right? So they might get some of that loaded onto them, where in reality it's really fluctuations in the firm fixed effects. One thing that we've been experimenting with is to think about ownership changes and having fixed effects for ownership regimes. There's two things there. The one thing is that this is quite a substantial amount of work to get all these ownership changes, and the other one is that some ownership changes are more significant than others, obviously. So the but it's indeed at some point that we need to probably come back to at some point, because obviously the owners can change more than the wage bill, which is what currently they have their fixed effect, and they can change the wage bill, and that's about it. They don't really change, or what's in the firm fixed effect is indeed given for this decade of data for most of these clubs. So when it comes to revenue estimation, and I think Stefan was also quite right in that, we probably need to do more work there anyway to make that more credible, because the current left-hand side is revenues, which doesn't feature in the first regression at all, and so that's out of there. It's just wage bill. What features in the what I think we need to think more about is indeed what you also pointed at, like what is the right lagging, for example, of when do you expect this performance to induce more revenues, and probably there is indeed a good case to be made for it to be more of a dynamic something, in the sense of indeed you promote, that's when you get your revenue bonus from your previous good performance. So we need to definitely do more work, I think, on thinking about what is the right sort of the right dynamics in that relationship, and performance should predate revenues. That's quite clear. So yeah, thank you for your comments. That's quite good. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, and you're very welcome to be with us as well. Delighted that you can be with us. We've got 5 minutes of regulation time left, and Ian Gregory Smith, from a city that has an English team with an English manager, has the next question.
Hi, Thomas. So I was trying to
Ian.
think a little bit about the mechanism, so why you might find matching here and not elsewhere. And so I was wondering if that has anything to do with how frequently managers are sacked. So it seems that in football we have some managers lasting, 3 months, sometimes 6 months on a fairly frequent basis. And I think it was, if I was comparing it to something like the executive labour market, where it's been claimed that you have a sort of matching as well, where you get sort of people who are just a little bit better getting sorted into larger companies. But there, it usually seems to be that you get headhunted, you get hired directly from, so you're an executive performing well at a company, and then you get hired directly from that company and become CEO at the other company. Whereas in football, there seems to be so many sackings. Like Mourinho gets sacked, he gets sacked again, he gets sacked again, and he can still get a job. So I don't know if that's playing a role or how you could counter it. I don't know. Or maybe you can look at sort of how frequently managers get sacked in the different countries and whether this explains any of the variation between countries.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and one that we've been thinking about also in relation with Stefan at some point, which is this question. So with this up or down regression at the end, where we so what we do now is we look at the beginning of the season only, and so basically allowing for, if you want to go and poach someone else's coach, you have, let's say, a couple of months to convince this person that you want to change them. So that would be more or less what's happening in the executive labor market, that you typically poach someone else's worker. We also have versions of this where we look at everybody that gets sacked, and then basically the number of movers that we can look at is much larger, because now actually every team only has one manager at the beginning of every season. But in reality, of course, there's much more common rematching of all of these sacked managers that are. We currently don't really use anybody that's sacked within the scope of a season. If they appear at the start of the next season, then they are there. But if there will be employment spells that are not regarded at all here, because we know that, some teams sack a manager, they hire someone else, and they sack that person again even before the season ends. So that spell would be completely lost in translation here, in this exercise. But as I said also during the presentation, we're trying to develop more this kind of idea of a regression on the sample of movers. And then, of course, everybody that gets sacked becomes quite interesting, because then we can see whether a sacking indeed harms your potential to move up, or whether, as you seem to say about Mourinho, it's actually not that big of a deal that you got sacked, and that you can just make a lateral move even though you were fired from your previous job, which probably in the CEO market would be quite unheard of, I imagine.
Yeah, so in the executive market, you can come back, but it's much, much more rare. So if you fail at a high-profile place, it's rare that you will then become a CEO at another high-profile company.
Yeah,
that
seems to
a lot
be
more frequently.
Yeah, some people seem to pull that off in this market, indeed. So yeah, the question. So one, I mean, the other. So the related thing that we've been thinking about is it rational to sack so often in this market? And one of the questions that we try to that we are also interested in, didn't make this presentation, is whether a sacking actually leads to an improvement. So when people sack their manager mid-season, do they pick someone that we estimate is actually better, or do they typically end up with someone that's actually about the same or even worse than what they, in our estimation at least, are they trading up? Are the firms trading up when they sack? So that's another question that we can sideways look at with this data. But that's indeed the part that we wanna develop more. So yeah, looking at those sackings and the career costs of sackings would actually be quite interesting, probably.
Sounds great.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Thomas, in particular, for a fascinating talk. And we are sat perfectly on full-time whistle. So all I'll say is next week we are back with JC Bradbury presenting the economics of stadium subsidies, a policy retrospective. So I look forward to seeing many of you again next week, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, James.